Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings, and so my third video on vacation, back to the Enchanted Forest Chronicles. So far we've read the last book chronologically in the series, Talking to Dragons, and we've read the first book chronologically in the series, Dealing with Dragons, which was written and which was published in 1990. We are now in the sequel to Dealing with Dragons, and that sequel is Searching for Dragons. This is the cover of the copy that I actually had as a kid growing up until it vanished and it was replaced by my four-parter that I've already mentioned several times. So, as you'll recall in the last video, I mentioned that these first three books were the expansion of the rapid-fire summary of how Daystar came to be shoved into the Enchanted Forest with a sword and told, do stuff. So the section of the summary, rather, that is covered is that following Kazul kicking the wizards out of the Mountains of Mourning, it made the wizards plenty mad, so they decided to start a war by getting the dragons to attack the Enchanted Forest. That was how Mother met my father. He came to see Kazul about some burned parts of the forest, and he found Mother instead. Then the two of them went searching for Kazul, who'd been kidnapped by the wizards, and by the time they got her free, they decided to get married. Kazul was Mother's matron of honor. And that's Searching for Dragons in a nutshell. So, this book, like the last two, starts with a brand new character. That is, each of the books in this series, the focus and the primary perspective of the book is told from a single person. This is one of those omniscient, semi-omniscient third-person narrators, but this book is from the perspective of Mendanbar, King Mendanbar, who, yes, he does wind up marrying Cimmerine. The thing is that King Mendanbar starts out this book, he's 20 years old, and he's more or less just come to his kingship over the Enchanted Forest. And one of the first issues that needs to be noted in this is that we kind of get the outsider's perspective on princesses. The thing is that in the last book, in Dealing with Dragons, we see what princesses are supposed to be like through Cimmerine's eyes. That is, we see all the things that princesses are supposed to learn, like when to scream when being carried away by a giant and how loudly. But we also, of course, that she's not supposed to learn anything else other than those particularly limited things. We saw the princesses, Caradwell and Helena, who both are completely normal princesses, and we saw how insufferable they were. And Alienora, who is an unsatisfactory princess, and thus does not act like a normal princess. Well, at the start of this book, Mendanbar is in conference with his steward, Willen, who is an elf from the Enchanted Forest. And they're actually having a very interesting conversation about the fact that they need a new rack in one of their dungeons. The northwest dungeon, if I recall correctly. And so Willen informs him that they need a new rack in the dungeon, and that the rack was removed in your great-great-grandfather's time and has never been replaced. Really? King Mendanbar said, interested in spite of himself. Why did he take it out? The little steward coughed. I believe your great-great-grandmother wanted it to dry tablecloths on. Tablecloths? Mendanbar looked out the window at the north-northwest tower and shook his head. She made someone haul a rack up 8 flights of stairs and down 6 more just to dry tablecloths? A very determined woman, your great-great-grandmother, Willin said. In any case, the dungeon is in need of a new rack. But Willin also goes after him about getting married, about how His Majesty should be getting married. And Mendanbar recoils in horror at the thought. He recoils in horror at the thought of marrying any of the daughters of Queen Alexandra, whose daughters are loveliest and accomplished princesses. But the thing is that while Mendanbar's dislike for princesses may seem to be a little bit excessive, in that he has very much a once you've seen one princess, you've seen them all perspective on it, something that I feel needs to be mentioned is the fact that, on average, there are between 1 and 12 princesses in any given country. That's just the numbers of princesses. That some countries have no princesses. The ones that do have princesses will usually, as I said, have between 1 and 12, the average number probably being 3. And by that I mean the mode average, that is the most frequently appearing number, as opposed to the mean average, which is adding up all the numbers and dividing by the number of numbers, or the median, which is the middlemost number out of a spread of numbers. Each of these averages, of course, has their downsides in practical use, but we're not going to be talking about statistics. The point is that if Mendanbar who says he has met dozens of princesses, that means that most likely he's met all of the princesses in I would wager, at least a couple dozen countries. And that's actually a pretty solid, sampling out of average available numbers of princesses to make certain assumptions. Beyond which, Cimmerian, of course, at various points in time bears out what he says by calling them silly and saying they can't help it. In any event, so Mendanbar, who is visited by Zeminar, who is causing trouble, because that's what Zeminar, the head wizard of the Society of Wizards, who, as we recall in the last book, were trying to get their choice of king on the throne of the mountains for the dragons in the Mountains of Mourning, and who laid siege to a castle in the first book. The wizards are, of course, the villains here, as they are through the whole series. And by the end of it, their reasons for doing what they're doing become clear, but in short, they're after power, which is what they're always after. Anyhow, so this is almost tied with Dealing with Dragons. It's kind of a second and a half favorite. This is not my favorite book in the series. It's certainly a great deal ahead of Talking to Dragons. And it's not a distant second to Dealing with Dragons. It is kind of a second to it. My favorite in this series is Calling on Dragons, but that's because cats. Which you will understand when we get there. Assuming, of course, that I don't ramble my way out of actually telling you things. Anyhow, so Mendanbar does something that is very Captain Kirk going on away mission-y. In spite of the fact that you would think that a king shouldn't be going adventuring because as the king he's supposed to be doing king stuff, like running a country. Mendanbar decides he's just going to march off on his own to visit the King of the Dragons, as though that's just a thing that people do. So when he gets there, he and Cimmerian sort of dance around each other a bit. But eventually he winds up accompanying her in trying to find Kazul, who has gone missing, who was supposed to be back yesterday and has not returned. And along the way they have various adventures, and Mendanbar is impressed and thinks Cimmerian is extremely pretty and awesome and smart. And then along their way, they meet the magician Telemaine. Now, Telemaine appears in Talking to Dragons, but he doesn't appear in Dealing with Dragons. He first really appears in this book as the frequently incomprehensible expert, one of those experts who talks about his expertise in highly technical language because, technical language is best when you are discussing technical stuff. When a lawyer is talking about the law, a lawyer will devolve into technical language because it's specific. It says what you mean to say, not just approximations. When a scientist is talking about chemistry or physics or anything else, they tend to devolve into scientific language because that says what you're trying to say. If you have a big vocabulary, you may also have noticed this problem where you'll use a word that is abstruse and people go, what? What does that even mean? But the problem is that that word says what you want it to mean, not something kind of like what you want to say. Well, Telemaine has that problem. And he has that problem with spells. That Telemaine is a research spellcaster. He calls himself a magician who studies many kinds of magic. But he doesn't do practical magic. He's a researcher. He is a magical scientist. And so he's extremely interesting as a character because on the one hand, he's one of the good guys, but on the other hand, he follows Mendanbar and Cimmerian back to the Enchanted Forest to find out where Kazul is and rescue her and so on and so forth, because he's interested in seeing wizards working in situ. He's interested in watching wizards do their spell casting where he can watch it and examine it. And so as a character, he can take you aback a little. He certainly leaves Cimmerian and Mendanbar taken aback. But we also find out in this book that he and Morwen actually grew up together, which is intriguing if for no other reason than that it creates this whole hidden backstory that that one can certainly wonder at. Now, the impetus for Mendanbar trekking around is because the Enchanted Forest, that he finds out one morning that the Enchanted Forest has a section that appears to have been burned, has been turned into a waste, as the aggravating princess that he runs into tells him. But that's because when you suck the magic out of the Enchanted Forest, there's nothing left. Strangely, the Enchanted Forest is not just a forest that has lots of magical stuff in it. The trees and plants and everything in it themselves are functionally made of magic. That it's part of the makeup of the actual forest, which is intriguing because it makes the forest a fundamentally stranger place than anything else. A place that functions on its own rules on top of fairy tale rules. Something that Mendanbar mentions frequently about not forgetting to follow directions because the forest will move on its own to thwart you. That you can't go around stuff because of how the forest actually works, and there's always a back entrance in the Enchanted Forest. And that's the end of this ramble, and we have one more book to go in the series, and I'll see you all next week.